Hello there, my name is Dr. Dean Fido and welcome to the Introduction to Psychopathy course. Lecture 1 is entitled A Brief History of Psychopathy, and throughout this lecture we'll be looking at early conceptualizations of psychopathy and how the term psychopathy has grown and developed throughout the literature. We'll also be introducing a couple of case studies as well as key researchers in the area. Moreover, we'll be looking at the comorbidity of antisocial personality disorder and how we tease psychopathy from this overlapping construct. However, first we'll begin with a brief activity. For activity 1, and before we move on to the start of the lecture, I'd like you to spend a couple of minutes writing down your initial thoughts about what psychopathy is. We're going to revisit these thoughts at the end of the course, so please keep your notes safe. Now, some of you might be asking, well, you've only just started the course. How will you know? And that's the point. What I want you to do is draw upon your knowledge of film, media and real life situations, as well as any newspaper articles that you may have seen. And please write down what you think the definition of psychopathy is, the way that psychopaths behave, the way that they talk, and also the things that they do in their day-to-day lives. For example, are they married with children? What types of jobs do they do? Are they all offenders? Pause the video and spend a few minutes doing this now, before moving on. Thank you. I hope you found that activity to be quite challenging, but overall informative. So, what are our learning outcomes going to be today? After this lecture, you will be able to, first, demonstrate an awareness of how the concept of psychopathy came to be, and how throughout the years it has altered and changed, and where we now situate it within the greater literature. And second, we want you to begin to challenge your preconceptions of psychopathy, and that's why we got you to do the activity prior to starting the course. Let's begin. I think it's important, before we go into any more detail, to provide a brief definition of what psychopathy is. Now, although brief, this definition might come across as being quite complex, and so I will talk us through it. Please note any words that you see highlighted in red, as these are of grave importance. So let's begin. Psychopathy is a personality disorder. We'll tease that apart in greater detail towards the end of this lecture. Describing individuals with a specific set of traits. Interpersonally, these individuals are described as grandiose and self-centered, so they care a lot about themselves. They come across as having an exaggerated sense of self-importance and tend to blame others for their failures or shortcomings. So they have an external locus of control. They don't blame themselves. They readily take advantage of others using charm, manipulation, and deception, which allows them to get quite close to individuals. Think about it. Their emotions tend to be shallow and insincere. They experience little guilt or remorse when they harm others. When you think about it, guilt and remorse help to act as protective factors, and if this is absent, then this behaviour is just going to carry on. They have a pronounced lack of empathy and are described as callous and cold. They are also described as being fearless and tend to be more reckless and take risks in several domains. Now start to think how this might have positive and negative outcomes. They have diminished concerns about punishment, physical injury, or social repercussions. From this sentence, think about how treatment may or may not be possible. Psychopaths are impulsive and seek reward and novelty. In life, they are often irresponsible and fail to make appropriate life plans. They tend to have a volatile temperament and can easily become irritable and hostile. So reflect on how they might act in social situations where things don't go their way. They show disregard for social norms and frequently engage in behaviour that would be considered immoral to most. The observation that this constellation of traits could be identified in individuals again and again, albeit in different forms, led to the idea that these traits represent a single disorder, psychopathy. Although this and other lectures in this lecture series will be focusing the discussion and associated research on the most up-to-date and current references of psychopathy, It is important not to forget the origins of such words and how they have been used and how these words have been developed throughout history. In terms of psychopathy, we can split this word into two parts. The first, psych, which is in reference to the soul or the mind, and the second, pathy, in reference to suffering or disease, a disease of the mind. As early as 1806, Pinel noted manie sans délire, which is in reference to insanity without delusion. Such individuals may appear insane, however, they are without delusion and know what they are doing. They are being instrumental in nature. In 1837, in the context of the construction of the profession of psychiatry, Pritchard noted moral insanity. Such individuals lacked morals and were therefore insane. In 1913, we talk about the Mental Deficiency Act, in which Parliament in the United Kingdom made provisions for the institutional treatment of people who they deemed to be feeble-minded and morally deficient. Kraepelin, in 1915, talked about possible psychopathic prototypes, such as individuals were predominantly socially excluded. They may also be inmates, delinquents, unstateable liars, swindlers, and those lacking all morals and empathy. And then in terms of 1930, we have Partridge, who coined the term sociopath. Now this might be a term you hear a lot about in the media, but it's important to discuss it with caution. Partridge identifies confusion in the definition and application of the diagnosis of psychopathy, such that at the time there were multiple mental illnesses which could be defined by personality deviation and amorality. However, Partridge noted that in terms of true psychopaths as we know them today, they had specific conditions relating to poor social maladjustment, and as such they coined the term sociopath. A key piece of literature within the field of psychopathy, or at least psychopathy as we note and discuss it in modern day terms, is that by psychiatrist Dr. Hervey Cleckley in 1941 in their book titled The Mask of Sanity. Now in this book, Dr. Hervey Cleckley referred to psychopathy as a convincing mask of sanity, which led individuals, these psychopaths, to all extensive purposes be able to behave and act as upright citizens within society. Cleckley noted a conflict between underlying pathology, such as deviant or impulsive desires, and a typical outward-facing persona. Such individuals might even be very successful in their lives. Now, psychopathic characteristics observed in this book are as follows. 1. Superficial charm and good intelligence. 2. An absence of delusions or any other signs of irrational thinking. 3. An absence of nervousness or psychoneurotic manifestations. 4. Unreliability. 5. Untruthfulness and insincerity in both their actions and the way they talk. 6. A lack of remorse or shame. 7. Inadequately motivated social behavior. 8. Poor judgment and failure to learn by their experiences. Such individuals are fearless and can't comply or learn from social faux pas. 9. Pathological egocentricity and an incapacity for love. 10. General poverty in major affective reactions. 11. Specific loss of insight. They can't ask themselves questions or introspect about their actions. 12. Unresponsive in general interpersonal relations. As we know, these individuals lack love. 13. Fantastic and uninviting behavior, with drink and sometimes without. These individuals are good at parties. They can always put on a show. 4. Suicide is rarely carried out. 15. Sex life is deemed impersonal, trivial, and poorly integrated within their relationships and life. And finally, 16. A failure to follow any life plan. Such individuals are able to hypothesize about long-term plans, but have no ability to actually plan to succeed in them. Now here's a case study of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy confessed to 30 homicides in addition to numerous counts of rape, burglary, and kidnap. Ted Bundy kept severed heads as mementos of his crimes. Dr. Hervey Cleckley was a psychiatrist for the prosecution in the trial which took place in 1979. Cleckley deemed Ted Bundy to be a clever psychopath. The defense used psychopathy as a means to argue that Bundy was not competent to stand trial, or to even represent himself. However, as a psychiatrist, Dr. Hervey Cleckley disagreed. Ted Bundy was found guilty and executed in January of 1989. Now, Ted Bundy is a character which we'll revisit throughout this lecture series, so please bear these crimes in mind when we do discuss him as a person. When discussing psychopathy, it is prudent not to talk about the overlap with antisocial personality disorder, a personality disorder talked about quite often in film, media, and the news. This is defined by a pervasive pattern of disregard for and the violation of the rights of others, often occurring since the age of 15, as indicated by 3 or more of the following criteria: having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another, a failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviours, as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest, deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure, impulsivity or a failure to plan ahead, irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults, reckless disregard for the safety of themselves or for others, consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain constant work, behaviour, or honour financial obligations, a lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent to or... Now you may be thinking that from what we've said in this lecture so far, that psychopathy is exactly the same as antisocial personality disorder. However, there are nuanced differences between these two concepts. In terms of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, which is a manual full of criterion for each different type of disorder, antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy are very close. However, there are key differences between these two constructs. Antisocial personality disorder focuses on the behavioural elements, such as the offences, the type of offending, and the aggressiveness and associated personality traits of those offenders. However, psychopathy instead focuses on the callous and affective components, this lack of guilt, this lack of empathy, and overall coldness of their demeanour. Now these are components which we'll talk about more deeply in lectures 3, 4 and 5 of this course. Research from Essie Vidding in 2004, which used the DSM-4 criteria, so the previous version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, noted that 80% of psychopaths meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. However, only 30% of those diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder meet the criteria for psychopathy. So yes, there is an overlap. However, these are two very different constructs, and we'll tease that apart more in subsequent lectures. So that brings us to the close of this first lecture. Throughout this lecture, we have explored some of the origins of the term psychopathy. You have been introduced to Dr. Hervey Cleckley and his Mask of Sanity, and you have examined Cleckley's profile of a psychopath. Moreover, we have teased apart psychopathy from antisocial personality disorder. In lecture 2, we'll be looking at different perspectives from the media and the news in terms of how we conceptualize psychopathy, and we'll begin to challenge some of your pre-existing opinions of the psychopath.